Hello and welcome to another installment of Schnee Reads Call of the Wild. This is assignment 11, chapter 5, part 1. So for this part of the reading, we are going to be looking at, once again, how the dialogue and events propel action and reveal character, and specifically, we're going to be looking at how Buck is becoming wilder throughout the story. Now, in this section, he takes a little bit of a setback, but he will not lose all of that. It will still be there under the surface. You're going to be comparing and contrasting how Buck's new owners, I should say just contrasting how they're different from the last ones, and you're going to be answering questions using details from the text. So what happened last time? So the team was sold by Francois and Perrault to the what they call the Scotch half-breed. So he works for the mail system. He's a very fair owner. He treats his dogs well. However, these are long trips with little rest, and the dogs, they're getting worn out. Buck also spends much of his time dreaming of a primitive man. Usually while he's sitting around the fire, he dreams of this man. And this is just a symbol of Buck becoming wilder. In a way, this is a call of the wild per se for him. Eventually, Dave gets ill and he gets worn out. And despite the fact that he still wants to run in the harness, he's too weak to continue and he must be put down. So this is the first of the dogs on the team since Curly that we are going to see dying off. All right, so now we're going to watch this short video from DNews that's looking at the idea of which is safer, the city or the country, because we're going to have some city dwellers in this next section who come out here to the country to mine for gold. And I want you to kind of keep in mind this is a modern day video, but would this have been the same back in the 1890s when our new group is coming? So do you think these things hold true for city dwellers going to the Yukon to find gold? Which do you think in that case would be safer or more dangerous? I want you to kind of keep these things in mind as you read and where were those people safer and happier in the city or are they happier in the country? Does it make any sense for them to come to the Yukon with no experience whatsoever? And what could they have done maybe to make their transition easier? All right.
Which is better, the city or the country? Thanks to science, we finally got the truth, and let's battle! Hey Earthlings, Trace here repping for DNews. The battle of city living versus country living has been going on forever. The United States started as a predominantly agrarian farming society. It's seen urban migrations and then suburban flight. And now we're seeing people rebound into urban and rural communities again. But where is the safest place for humans to live overall? In the concrete jungle or the actual jungle? The Purple Mountain's majesty or the majesty of public transportation? A new study from the Annals of Emergency Medicine has determined which of the two is safer. It's a city. The city is the safer place. Take that, Amber Waves of Grain. What up? No one is saying the country sucks, because I would never say that. My high school was literally next to a cornfield. I grew up in the country. According to the study, people living in urban areas are 20% less likely to die from a serious injury than people who live in rural parts of the country. Looking at the major ways people die before their time, the burden is heavily on rural. The top 3 non-health related killers across our nation are drug-related poisoning, shootings, and car accidents. While usually we think of homicides and muggings as dangers of the city, gun-related deaths are equally likely in both urban and rural areas, but both are far outweighed by car crashes, which are twice as likely to kill in a rural area. In fact, if you include health-related issues, the Wall Street Journal says rural residents are more likely to be obese, sedentary, and smoke cigarettes, and they face higher rates of diabetes, stroke, heart attacks, and high blood pressure because of that. Not to mention, they're further from hospital care, with the average wait for an ambulance being almost 18 minutes. Urban areas ain't always raise the sunshine through the smog either. Nature published a study in 2010 finding mood and anxiety disorders are definitely more prevalent in city dwellers. Simply being raised in a city strongly increases the chances of developing schizophrenia. Wow. Is anxiety, depression, and a possible mental breakdown worth able to walk to a theater on a Tuesday? I don't know. People in urban areas also have higher rates of sexually transmitted infections and produce low birth weight babies more often. They have higher rates of asthma, food allergies, and autoimmune disorders than country folk. We city folk are like beat down by the city. Regardless of where you live, if you want to up your health and lifespan, eat right, exercise, and take care of yourself. These aren't hard and fast rules, but are generalizations across the country. So what do you think? Would you rather desire a streetcar or a home on the range? Tell us about it, and we'll see you with more news of the world around you next time on D News.
So as you saw in this clip, they think the country is not necessarily safer than the city. However, there are a lot of health problems that are caused in the city. However, what we're going to be looking at in this section is how these city people react to living in the country. How do you think that's going to go for them? That's just something to think about. All right, now that we've gotten that a little bit of intro information, we are going to continue on in this video to Chapter 5, Part 1. And then after that's done, you're going to be using your text to answer the questions on Schoology, and please use race for your short answers. So now we're going to be reading Chapter 5, Part 1, The Toil of Trace and Trail. 30 days from the time it left Dawson, the saltwater mail with Buck and his mates at the fore arrived at Skagway. They were in a wretched state, worn out and worn down. Buck's 140 pounds had dwindled to 115. The rest of his mates, though lighter dogs, had relatively lost more weight than he. Pike the malingerer, who in his lifetime of deceit had often successfully feigned a hurt leg, was now limping in earnest. Sol-leks was limping, and Dub was suffering from a wretched shoulder blade. They were all terribly footsore. No spring or rebound was left in them. Their feet fell heavily on the trail, jarring their bodies and doubling the fatigue of a day's travel. There was nothing the matter with them except that they were dead tired. It was not the dead tiredness that comes through brief and excessive effort, from which recovery is a matter of hours, but it was the dead tiredness that comes through the slow and prolonged strength drainage of months of toil. There was no power of recuperation left, no reserved strength to call upon. It had been all used, the least bit of it. Every muscle, every fiber, every cell was tired, dead tired, and there was reason for it. In less than 5 months they had traveled 2,500 miles, during the last 1,800 of which they had had but 5 days' rest. When they arrived at Skagway, they were apparently on their last legs. They could barely keep the traces taut, and on the downgrades just managed to keep out of the way of the sled. "Mush on, poor sore feets," the driver encouraged them as they tottered down the main street of Skagway. "Dis is the last, and then we get one long run, eh? For sure, one bully long rest." The drivers confidently expected a long stopover. Themselves, they had covered 1,200 miles with 2 days' rest, and in the nature of reason and common justice, they deserved an interval of loafing. But so many were the men who had rushed into the Klondike, and so many were the sweethearts, wives, and kin that had not rushed in, that the congested mail was taking on Alpine proportions. Also, there were official orders. Fresh batches of Hudson Bay dogs were to take place of those worthless for the trail. The worthless ones were to be got rid of, and since dogs count for little against dollars, they were to be sold. All right, so since there are so many people coming into the territory, with so many families being left back at home, there's more mail, there's more government orders, and the team has been nonstop for 5 months, covering 2,500 miles. So since the dogs are tired and worn out, the men will get new dogs, and Buck and his team are now going to be sold to yet another group of owners. 3 days passed, by which time Buck and his mates found how really tired and weak they were. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, 2 men from the States came along and bought them, harnesses and all, for a song. The men addressed each other as Hal and Charles. Charles was a middle-aged, lightish-colored man with weak and watery eyes and a mustache that twisted fiercely and vigorously up, giving the lie to the limply drooping lip it concealed. Hal was a youngster of 19 or 20, with a big Colt's revolver and a hunting knife strapped about him on a belt that fairly bristled with cartridges. This belt was the most salient thing about him. It advertised his callowness, a callowness sheer and unutterable. Both men were manifestly out of place, and why such as they should adventure the North is part of the mystery of the things that passes understanding. Buck heard the chaffing, saw the money pass between the man and the government agent, and knew that the Scotch half-breed and the mail train drivers were passing out of his life on the heels of Perrault and Francois, and the others who had gone before. When driven with his mates to the new owner's camp, Buck saw a slipshod and slovenly affair, tent half stretched, dishes unwashed, and everything in disorder. Also, he saw a woman, Mercedes, the men called her. She was Charles's wife and Hal's sister. A nice family party. All right, so these people are city folks who know nothing about prospecting for gold, let alone surviving in the wilderness. They are weak, they are awkward, and their camp is messy and half-heartedly put together. So there is really nothing good about this group of people that Buck is going to be sold into at this point. Buck watched them apprehensively as they proceeded to take down the tent and load the sled. There was a great deal of effort about their manner, but no businesslike method. The tent was rolled into an awkward bundle 3 times as large as it should have been. The tin dishes were packed away unwashed. Mercedes continually fluttered in the way of her men and kept up an unbroken chattering of remonstrance and advice. When they put a clothes sack on the front of the sled, she suggested it should go on the back, and when they had put it on the back and covered it over with a couple of other bundles, she discovered overlooked articles which could abide nowhere else but in that very sack, and they unloaded again. 3 men from a neighboring tent came out and looked on, grinning and winking at one another. "You've got a right smart load as it is," the one of them said one of them, "and it's not me should tell you your business, but I wouldn't tote that tent along if I was you." "Undreamed of!" Mercedes cried, throwing up her hands in dainty dismay. "How ever in the world could I manage without a tent? It's springtime, and you won't get any more cold weather," the man replied. So the men here are basically watching, and they're trying to give better advice because they know better, and they're trying to lighten the load for the people and the dogs. But Mercedes can't possibly deal without a tent and sleeping under the stars, so she refuses, even though that most people at this time in spring would go without a tent. Most of these prospectors would sleep in a sleeping bag under the stars and not think anything of it. She's a city girl who has probably never slept out in wilderness a day in her life. She shook her head decidedly, and Charles and Hal put the last odds and ends on top the mountainous load. "Think it'll ride?" one of the men asked. "Why shouldn't it?" Charles demanded rather shortly. "Oh, that's all right, that's all right," the man hastened meekly to say. "I was just wondering, that's all. It seemed a mite top-heavy." Charles turned his back and drew the lashings down as well as he could, which was not in the least well. "And of course the dogs can hike along all day with that contraption behind them," affirmed a second of the men. "Certainly," said Hal with freezing politeness, taking hold of the gee-pole with one hand and swinging his whip from the other. "Mush!" he shouted. "Mush on there!" All right, so once again, these people think they know everything, and they're not willing to listen to people who actually know what the heck they're talking about. So they're proud and ignorant because of that pride, and that pride is going to be their ultimate downfall. The dogs sprang against the breastbands, strained hard for a few moments, then relaxed. They were unable to move the sled. "The lazy brutes! I'll show them!" he cried, preparing to lash out at them with the whip. But Mercedes, interfering, cried, "Oh, Hal, you mustn't!" as she caught hold of the whip and wrenched it from him. "The poor dears! Now you must promise you won't be harsh with them for the rest of the trip, or I won't go a step." "Precious lot you know about dogs," her brother sneered, "and I wish you'd leave me alone. They're lazy, I tell you, and you've got to whip them to get anything out of them. That's their way. You ask anyone. Ask one of those men." All right, so they're also too ignorant to know that they bought dogs that are worn down. These dogs can't really pull anymore. They're really not worth the money they paid for them, and the dogs need a huge rest. So Hal thinks they're lazy, and he wants to whip them and punish them out of their laziness. And Mercedes treats them like pets and not working dogs. So she sits in here, pitying these dogs. Meanwhile, if they just gave him a little help, like lightening the load or something like that, this situation wouldn't be so bad. Mercedes looked at them imploringly, untold repugnance at sight of pain written in her pretty face. "They're weak as water, if you want to know," came the reply from one of the men. "Plumb tuckered out, that's what's the matter. They need a rest." "Rest be blanked," said Hal with his beardless lips, and Mercedes said "Oh!" in pain and sorrow at the oath. But she was clannish creature, and rushed at once to the defense of her brother. "Never mind that man," she said pointedly. "You're driving your dogs, and you do what you think is best with them." Again Hal's whip fell upon the dogs. They threw themselves against the breastbands, dug their feet into the packed snow, got down low to it, and put forth all their strength. The sled held as though it were an anchor. After 2 efforts they stood still, panting. The whip was whistling savagely, when once more Mercedes interfered. She dropped on her knees before Buck with tears in her eyes, and put her arms around his neck. "You poor, poor dears," she cried sympathetically. "Why don't you pull hard? And then you wouldn't be whipped." Buck did not like her, but he was feeling too miserable to resist her, taking it as a part of the day's miserable work. So Hal whips the dogs mercilessly, and Mercedes tries to reason with the dogs, and she can't understand, and the dogs, I should say, can't understand speech. So all the while, where's Charles in all of this? All right. He's the weak one. He's avoiding confrontation. And you have this brother and sister team arguing back and forth. So in this situation, the youngest one is the one who's pretty much leading the pack. One of the onlookers, who had been clenching his teeth to suppress hot speech, now spoke up. "It's not that I care a whoop what becomes of you, but for the dog's sake, I just want to tell you, you can help them a mighty lot by breaking out the sled. The runners are froze fast. Throw your weight against the gee pole, right and left, and break it out." So the sled runners are frozen in the snow. They're frozen in the ice that builds up overnight, and it causes them not to be able to move. So the dogs basically have to not only pull this heavy sled, but try to break the sled out of the ice. All right. So if they rock the sled back and forth, then that'll help break the ice and it'll help break the sled loose. All right. This is going to come up again later in the story in the next chapter. A third time the attempt was made, but this time, following the advice, Hal broke out the runners, which had been frozen to the snow. The overloaded and unwieldy sled forged ahead, Buck and his mates struggling frantically under the rain of blows. 100 yards ahead the path turned and sloped steeply into the main street. It would have required an experienced man to keep the top-heavy sled upright, and Hal was not such a man. As they swung on the turn, the sled went over, spilling half its load through the loose lashings. The dogs never stopped. The lightened sled bound on its side behind them, and they were angry because of the ill treatment they had received and the unjust load. Buck was raging. He broke into a run. The team followed his lead. Hal cried, "Whoa, whoa!" But they gave no heed. He tripped and was pulled off his feet. The capsized sled ground over him, and the dogs lashed on up the street, adding to the gaiety of Skagway as they scattered the remainder of the outfit along its chief thoroughfare. So Buck basically goes from good treatment and fair and just treatment to this bad situation. And he's back to good, and now he goes from good treatment to bad treatment with the man in the red sweater, back to good treatment with Perrault and Francois and the Scotch half-breed, and now he's back to this bad treatment again. So he has this experience. He knows what is coming and what it's going to be like. So because of that, he rebels and he encourages the rest of the team to do so. And basically, you get this comic scene of this oafish guy who can't hold onto the sled. The sled tips over. He falls off and kind of gets run over by the sled. And the dogs keep running with the sled, and all their belongings are being scattered along the main street in Skagway. And everybody is watching this massive scene of embarrassment for these city dwellers who really don't belong here. Kind-hearted citizens caught the dogs and gathered up the scattered belongings. Also, they gave advice. Half the load and twice the dogs, if they ever expected to reach Dawson, was what was said. Hal and his sister and brother-in-law listened unwillingly, pitched tent, and overhauled the outfit. Canned goods were turned out and that made men laugh, for canned goods on the long trail is a thing to dream about. Blankets for a hotel, quote one of the men who laughed and helped. Half as many is too much. Get rid of them. Throw away that tent and all those dishes. Who's going to wash them anyway? Good Lord, do you think you're traveling on a Pullman? So we find out that these people are living like they're in a hotel, or a Pullman is a type of train. Um, and instead of living like most people would on the trail, they're living like they would in a hotel, which causes the sled to be too heavy for the dogs. So now they're being told to get rid of most of their fancy, unnecessary belongings. And so it went, the inexorable elimination of the superfluous. Mercedes cried when her clothes bags were dumped on the ground and article after article was thrown out. She cried in general, and she cried in particular over each discarded thing. She collapsed, hands about knees, rocking back and forth broken-heartedly. She averred she would not go an inch, not for a dozen Charleses. She appealed to everybody and to everything, and finally, wiping her eyes and proceeding to cast out even articles of apparel that were imperative necessaries. And in her zeal, when she had finished with her own, she attacked the belongings of her men and went through them like a tornado. So she's so angry that she won't get all of these comforts of home, and they're getting rid of all her clothes and unneeded items, that she starts actually getting rid of things that are actually needed in this process. And then, as a sort of revenge, she starts attacking the clothes and the possessions of the men that are with her, and starts throwing away some of their belongings as well. This accomplished the outfit. Though cut in half, was still a formidable bulk. Charles and Hal went out in the evening and bought 6 outside dogs. These, added to the 6 of the original team, and Teek and Kuna, the huskies obtained at the Rink Rapids on the record trip, brought the team up to 14. But the outside dogs, though particularly broken in since their landing, did not amount to much. 3 were short-haired pointers, 1 was a Newfoundland, and the other 2 were mongrels of indeterminate breed. They did not seem to know anything, these newcomers. Buck and his comrades looked upon them with disgust, and though he speedily taught them their places and what not to do, he could not teach them what to do. They did not take kindly to trace and trail, with the exception of the 2 mongrels. They were bewildered and spirit broken by the strange savage environment in which they found themselves, by the ill treatment they had received. The 2 mongrels were without spirit at all. Bones were the only things breakable about them. So more dogs are bought, and only 2 of them are kind of meant to be sled dogs. When they say mongrels, they mean mutts in this case. So Teek and Kuna are the only 2 extras that had been added to the team recently that were actually any decent. All the rest of the dogs, they're mutts, they have no spirit, and people can't learn correctly because they refuse to do research or listen to the advice. So they're putting themselves and their dogs in danger, because they're bringing on these new dogs, and the dogs have no respect for the people at all, and the old dogs have no respect for the new dogs. So this is probably not going to be a well-working team like Buck had actually gotten into place before. With the newcomers hopeless and forlorn, and the old team worn out by 2,500 miles of continuous trail, the outlook was anything but bright. The 2 men, however, were quite cheerful, and they were proud too. They were doing the thing in style with 14 dogs. They had seen other sleds depart over the pass for Dawson or come in from Dawson, but never had they seen a sled with so many as 14 dogs. In the nature of Arctic travel, there was a reason why 14 dogs should not drag one sled, and that was that one sled could not carry the food for 14 dogs. But Charles and Hal did not know this. They had worked the trip out with a pencil, so much to a dog, so many dogs, so many days. QED, Mercedes looked over her shoulder and nodded comprehensively. It was all so very simple. So they think that having 14 dogs is a status symbol and that these dogs are going to be able to pull their sled better, and it's going to make them look good. But these dogs are broken. They need a rest, the old dogs, that is. The new dogs are inexperienced. And the men didn't pack or plan rations for 14 dogs. So this is a bad situation and only get worse. Hint, hint, hint. This is foreshadowing. They don't have enough food for 14 dogs. What do you think is going to happen in this situation? All right. So you've got a decent amount of multiple choice, but you only got one short answer today. So how do Charles and Mercedes and Hal differ from Perrault and Francois? All right, I need at least two quotes here. If you want to go back and get old quotes about Francois and Perrault, that's fine. Otherwise, just summarize them. But two quotes from this section that talk about Hal and Charles and Mercedes and what they are like and predict how their trip will go for them. You can also use a quote for that and one for the other one. That's fine. I don't care how you break up the quotes from this chapter, but just two. All right. Thank you. Have a great day, and we'll see you on the next installment.